I think I'm live. Am I live? Can you hear me, YouTube? Are you guys out there? I'm going to trust that y'all are. I see some folks finding their way in here. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to grade school. I'm really, really excited about what we're doing today because I just think it's going to be a hell of a lot of fun. And I think we're all in for some surprises, and we're going to learn a thing or two, myself included. Before I dive into what we're actually going to be doing today, I just want to sort of point out on a broader conceptual, philosophical level, the power of limitations. Any of us who've got any kind of experience in any sort of craft or creative endeavor have had the experience at least once of like, oh my God, like whether it's a deadline to submit something or whether it's like, I remember we did an exercise in film school where they're like, you have to make a film with just one cut. Like whatever the limitation is, it can be completely arbitrary, but man, it just can set your imagination free, sort of as a paradox there. So that's very much how I feel about the exercise that we're going to be doing today, which is saying, all right, you get 3 tools and you're going to grade everything with just those 3 tools. So I'm going to see how I do today. I've picked out 3 and I'm hoping that I can live by them, and you guys can watch me try to for the next couple minutes here. Really glad you guys are here. Hope everyone's having an awesome week, an awesome December. I'm having a great week. I was just telling my buddy Gadali, who's joined me today to help moderate the chat, that as soon as time opens up in one area of life, I don't know what it says about my personality, but I just tend to fill it with something else. So I've been on a mad tear of coding all this week and figuring out some new stuff, learning some new stuff, but all that free time that I thought I might have at the beginning of the week has somehow evaporated into the mist of trying to solve coding problems. So that's I don't know if I hope that's what's happening with you guys or if you're actually wise enough to just enjoy having bandwidth if you do. But that's where I'm at, and I'm excited to get away from staring at line after line of code and trying to figure out what I'm doing wrong and actually talk and speak and interact with you guys and go back to the creative side just a little bit. And I see already Alexander is starting to take stabs at what the 3 knobs are. You guys can feel free to chime in at any point and make some educated guesses as to what 3 tools I'm going to choose for this exercise. Now, just to sort of like frame the exercise and give it a bit more specificity before I dive in, here's the way I'm thinking about it. So the first thing is I'm not including color management as one of my picks because color management is not a tool of color grading. Color management is what surrounds our color grading, okay? So we're gonna be working color managed as I always do. So that doesn't count against my 3, okay? And from there, I am gonna pick out 3, and I'm gonna aim myself at the task of grading up this entire project that I have pulled in here. Let me flip onto it. This is a short film that I graded earlier this year. Really beautiful film called The Laundromat of Malibu. It's all set inside of this laundromat here. And right now we are looking at only my color management. So just to kind of catch us up on that front, if I go to my project settings, these are not like magical project settings. These are not like, there's nothing sacred about these. Let me actually get these turned on since I am finally learning from experience that you guys can't see what the hell I'm looking at by default here. Let's do this guy. There we go. So here's what I've got for my color management right now. I'm doing DaVinci YRGB color managed. I'm not doing the new 17.4 automatic color management, which we can talk about in a future grade school. I'm doing a full custom color processing mode, and I'm doing it in this way because it's actually, despite needing to set all these parameters in a particular way, it nets out to a really, really simple color management pipeline that basically says, hey, all my stuff's airy, don't input map it, I'm gonna work in airy, and then at the very tail of the stack, assume a full 10,000 net maximum luminance image and compress that down to a Rec 7 or 9 Gamma 2.4 100 nit image. So that's what my color management is. That's how I have it set up here, and a bit about why I have it set up that way. You can rip this off if you want to see what it looks like. But as I said, there's nothing particularly sacred about it. It's just the way that is going to work nicely for this project. Now, let's take a look at this timeline. And I'm going to kind of work in reverse order of, I'm going to talk about the tools in a different order than I'm going to use the tools. So I'm just curious. Let's see if we've got any other guesses on tools. Yeah, so does offset and RGB offset count as 3 different tools? No. So let me kind of finish framing up my assumptions or my rules or my boundaries for this exercise. I'm assuming like offset, whether I'm using it to uniformly manipulate red, green, and blue, which is what the offset wheel does, or whether I'm using the offset ball and individually manipulating red, green, and blue, that's the same tool. That's just, do you want to manipulate all 3 of your channels at once, or do you want to only manipulate 1 or 2 of those channels? So that's the same thing. That's fair play. We've got some good guesses coming in here. The very last comment there about using LAB or YUV. Color models, other color spaces, those are fair play. Those fall under the heading of overall image pipeline to me. So I can move in and out of those things as much as I want to, and those don't count as tools, and I can get different results out of my different pieces. And I'm already seeing a couple of good guesses come in here, and I'll sort of frame what I see as the fundamental. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to give you guys tool number 1, the most essential tool to this process, the tool, maybe not the most essential, but the tool that I'm going to use more than any other tool of these 3 that we're going to talk about here today. First one is going to be offset. Okay. Now, if I were in a linear domain, if I was working in linear, which I sometimes do, as you guys know, that would instead of selecting offset, I would choose gain. But there's for purposes of today's discussion, there's really no difference. I'm picking offset for a couple of reasons. First of all, I need some way to move exposure. You guys know how much affinity I have for exposure as the foundation of all good color grading. I need some way to directly and cleanly manipulate my exposure, and I think offset is a really good way of doing that. I'm also choosing it for a bit of a sentimental reason, because if we look back at the history of motion imaging and we think about the people who preceded us as colorists, the color timers or color graders of yesteryear who were working on films, you guys probably already know this because I talk about it all the time. Do you know how many tools those men and ladies had when they were like exacting the creative vision of their clients on the film print? They had 1 tool, and that tool was offset, literally plus red, plus green, and/or plus blue, or minus red, minus green, and/or minus blue. That was all they had. So I want to give a nod to our forebearers and use our offset for that reason as well. But that's going to be my anchor thing. That's going to be the first thing that I go to on any image, okay? So if we look at where I'm at with this timeline right now, I've got my color management turned on, which as we've decided doesn't count against me. And if I did nothing but properly color manage and work my offsets, I could start to get decent results. I could at least set exposure. Like if you were to make this desert island challenge even more difficult on me and say you only get 1 tool, it would definitely be offset, because at least I can sweeten exposure on each of these frames. So, you know, on any one of these, I can just kind of dial that in to taste. However, I have 2 key challenges that sit in front of me. I've got one challenge that one more thing I'd really like to be able to do on my individual clips, but there's another even bigger challenge that if we again think about color timers and the way that they worked, what is the fundamental ingredient that facilitated that single tool, that allowed them to get away with using a single tool when they were grading? Does anybody have a guess? You can sound it off in the chat there. I know I'm a couple minutes behind, but I'm actually curious if anyone can guess at this one. To repeat the question, what is the fundamental other ingredient in the overall process of taking a film negative and making a reproduced image out of it? What is the other ingredient that allowed a color timer to get away with doing nothing but adding or subtracting red, green, and/or blue? What facilitated that? Anyone have any guesses? How does To Catch a Thief look like To Catch a Thief with only plus red, minus red, plus green, plus blue, minus blue? They really just did that with offset? How did they do that? Printer lights is a good guess. Printer lights actually is exactly what I'm talking about, though, when I talk about offset. This is I might actually experiment in the future with doing. I think there's like a lower lag form of live stream that we can do. It's kind of fun interacting with you guys as there's some smart folks out here and some good guesses coming in already. Yeah, I see Printer Lights pouring in. Printer Lights is a great guess, but Printer Lights actually is what offset is, quite literally. That's what I mean when I say offset. I'm going to give it away. Do you know why Apocalypse Now looks like Apocalypse Now? Close Encounters of the Third Kind looks like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's not because the color timer shaped that with their offset. It's because they were feeding into a film print. Film prints facilitated the overall image to be able to look like it did, to have the polish that it did, and the palette, and that sweet contrast ratio, and color separation, and hue sweetening, all that stuff that we love about filmic image reproduction. That's really facilitated and standing on the shoulders of the film print, which is a highly engineered substance, okay? So that is what I am most missing right now in my stack. And I see Jamie did get it, print and neg. That's exactly right. So I could roll the negative into this conversation as well, although the negative was traditionally aimed at a much more neutral capture, and more of the color character is really meant to be imparted into the print, and the system itself is designed to sort of like, so those two elements could balance one another out against the things they couldn't iron out in one of those elements individually. Anyway, the film print is the piece of character that I am missing from this equation right now. So what do I mean when I'm talking about that right now? We're in a digital box. We're not printing film, obviously. What I'm talking about is look dev. I cannot build a look with offset. I mean, I could try, but it's not going to be very, it's not going to be very good. It's going to be, I'm going to be very limited in terms of what I can do, because that's a situation where the simplicity of offset and or printer lights, whatever you want to call them, is actually working against us, because all we can do is add or subtract red, green, or blue. We can't shape or bend or remap or contort or refine things at all. All we can do is really crudely move things around. And the reason why that works so well on individual clips, whether you're a color timer or a colorist working in a proper setup here in 2021, is to the extent that you are working underneath a really good look that is doing more complex stuff on a consistent basis downstream of there, kind of under the hood on your behalf, without you having to revisit those behaviors shot after shot after shot. So that is what I'm missing next. And that is actually going to be, like I said, push come to shove, there's other stuff I'd like to be able to do at the clip level. But push come to shove, I can grade this timeline with I can grade the clips with just my offset. I'm pretty comfortable with that. I need tools for doing my look dev. So I'm going to use 2 additional tools for that. This is why the other 2 tools in my stack I selected because of what they can do for me on the look dev side, okay? And they will have some benefit, one of them anyway, at the local shot level, but not as much as what they're going to do for me at the overall level. So I'm just curious. Let's see if we had any guesses out there. Okay, no guesses on my other 2. I'm going to give you guys just a second. I'm going to hold you in suspense. And in the meanwhile, I'm just going to kind of demo out, like, you know, what it is for me when I'm sweetening exposure. This is, by the way, an incredibly valuable exercise for you to do. Tee up your color management and just buzz through, see how much you can make yourself like your shot by just adjusting your exposure. You will be surprised at how far you can get when you force yourself to stay with that decision for just a little bit longer. You can get further than you think just by lingering on that decision and refusing to move off of it until you've got things looking really good. So that's kind of how I would start to begin to work things if I was doing my offsets. Some of these clips have had their input color space stubbornly left in the wrong place. So I'm going to periodically have to do that move right there to get the proper color management. But that's kind of what I'm seeing with those. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not thinking of offset wheel and offset ball as different tools. They're the same tool. They're the same operation being applied to the red, green, and or blue channels of the image. It's just a question of, do you want to apply it to all 3, to just 2, or to just 1? So in all these cases, after sweetening that exposure, I could do a new node, and I would start to work with my RGB offsets as well, and probably have my vector scope there as well for that, just to kind of get a reality check on how I'm doing. And same kind of thing here. This is such a powerful exercise. Like, Think about things like, okay, now that I'm balancing, I can think about balancing as a sort of mechanical exercise of like, oh, I need to make sure I'm getting a more neutral reproduction. Like, okay, fine. And if there's a white thing in the frame or something that I can use as the basis for that, that's fine. A lot of the time what I'm looking for, what I'm balancing, at least to the extent that my skin is already looking reasonably good, maybe start with skin. That's probably the most important. But the next thing that I'm often looking for kind of subconsciously when I'm balancing is I want to max out my color separation. And you guys can see, like if I go to this wide frame here, this one here is a great example. I'm going to go a little bit less moody on my offset here. And I'm going to go to a new node now. And I'm going to start to work my balance, okay? And as I do, what I'm going to look for on my scope and in the image is where am I maxing out my separation? Where am I getting the greatest feeling of color contrast between, say, the floor and the washing machines and the walls and the talent's wardrobe? Where am I getting like the maximum separation there without having to do anything fancier than offset? That's a great place to begin there. So you guys can see, like, that's not bad right there. I'm definitely getting more color separation here at this position than I had before. My colors are popping more against one another. So all stuff that we can do just with our offsets. Now, let's see if we had any good guesses out here. Let's see here. All right, so we got offset, curves, and color warper. We got log wheel, lift gain, contrast pivot. Jamie, colloid print node. I wish I could, but I did feel like for this exercise, that's not fair play. That's one of my limitations. I'm going to limit myself to the resolve. Film print emulation, great guess as well. I would love to have a solid FPE LUT or my colloid tools that I could drop in. But again, I feel like that's kind of out of bounds. I'm actually going to try to do everything inside the box here. Log shadow, log highlights, good guesses as well. Channel mixer, color warper, all good guesses. So let me turn on my scopes here as well since I see that question. And I'll put it to you guys this way. Both of my next two picks are in the list that we came through. My next two picks, drum roll please, are my curves, my custom curves specifically, and my channel mixer or my RGB mixer. And here's my reason why. The curves I can use for the main thing that I am hurting for still at the individual clip level here, which is like, man, I really want to be able to adjust my contrast. So before I get into the look dev side of things, let's just hang out here at the shot level for a little bit longer. And I'm going to show you guys how I'm going to cheat a little bit and use my curves before I even use them for their more complex application that they're really going to help me out with in a minute. I'm going to use my curves to build a contrast node because I don't have a contrast knob. Contrast is like one of the main tools that I use when I'm grading, and I need a contrast knob. So we're going to build a contrast knob real quick here. Now, here's the fun thing. If we think about needing to build a contrast knob, what's the sibling or the companion to the contrast knob? It would be pivot, right? However, if I have offset, I don't really need a pivot because I can simply move my offset upstream of the contrast and change how that contrast is being distributed accordingly. Yeah, it would be nice to have the two, but I can get most of the benefits of a contrast pivot simply by properly setting my offset upstream, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a contrast knob. I'm going to go over to my custom curves here. And because I want to make a neutral contrast knob that borrows equally from the bottom and from the top and either increases or decreases contrast, let's just check out how we could do that. So we're going to make a negative contrast knob first, and then I'm going to make a positive contrast knob. So all I'm going to do is take my upper control point here, and I'm going to drop it down so that it's on line with this first horizontal line down from the top. And now I'm going to do the same thing at the bottom here. And I'm going to bring this up from the bottom to this first horizontal line down from the bottom. So all I've done here is create a contrast adjustment that's composed of 50% gain and 50% lift and a lot of it, right? Like I don't anticipate ever needing to go this far and at any point in this timeline. And that's the whole point, because what I'm going to do now is go to my key output gain, which I'm not going to count as a tool because all that I'm doing here is saying how much of this node am I allowing to actually impact the image. This is just transparency that I'm doing here. This is not an actual tool. This is just saying how much of it do you want, okay? So if I now go to my key output gain, I could label this node decon or whatever I want to call it. And and I could leave it at a unity position of 0, okay? So I can make this part of my stock node graph. And now, if I want to make a decontrast adjustment on an individual clip, I would just go to this node and increase my key output gain. And as I do, I'm getting less and less contrast, and I'm borrowing equally from the bottom and from the top. Pretty cool, right? Same exact thing for positive contrast. If I do a new node, go to my custom curves, and go one click, one vertical line to the left, and one vertical line to the right, I'm now increasing my lift and gain in equal measure in a positive direction. Label this con, like so. Let's do the key output gain to 0 on this guy, and let me set that to 0 over here. And these two things would end up becoming part of like my template node tree for this desert island challenge. So as I'm going in through here, if I want to do positive contrast that's hitting equal parts lift and gain in the bottom and the top, I could do it like so, right? And again, I'm just talking about very simple linear adjustments that I see myself wanting to make at the clip level. So I now have global exposure, I have global offset or RGB balance, and I have negative and positive contrast, all with simply using my offset and my curves. And by my tally, which I think is fair, I hope you guys will agree with me, is a fair tally, and I'm not bending the rules too much, I'm only 2 tools in, and I can reuse these curves in a really significant way at the overall look level for this project. So, like I said, I'm kind of going backwards because I wanted to list out the tools I'm using from the simplest and most intuitive and work out to the more complex ones. But the way I would actually use these in this Desert Island Challenge is I would probably set up this node tree like so. So this exposure node, or maybe I would just do EXP. I would just label it and leave it empty and know that that's where all of my offset wheel stuff is going to happen. Next node, I would do BAL for balance and know that that's where all my individual offset RGB stuff is going to happen. And then I would have my templated decon and con nodes built out here and know that this in the Desert Island Challenge are the 4 nodes I'm going to use on every single shot to get the clip level adjustments that I need, okay? Now, let's save this as a still, or better yet, let's just ripple it. I'm just going to select everything. I'm going to hit Command A, and I'm going to middle click on this shot. And now every shot in this timeline has this template node graph, okay? No shot has received any grade yet because these are all dummy nodes at the moment, but I have a template that I can work my way through in the same way that you guys have seen me do for other kind of grade along videos. So with that in place, we've got our template node graph. We know what we're going to do, how we're going to do it at the individual clip level, and we've already got our color management in place. The next thing I'm going to do in our sequencing today is actually what I would be doing first in this process, which is like, okay, I need to get my overall look built out before I go any further. Now, I'm in Resolve Color Management, so I would want to, let's actually just do a quick test here. I don't actually know if my timeline stuff happens downstream or upstream of my output transform. Okay, so that's upstream, good. So we're gonna build out our look, and we're gonna build out our look with just 2 ingredients, okay? Those 2 ingredients are going to be our curves and our RGB mixer, like we talked about before. So curves, nothing earth-shattering here. I'm just gonna build out a nice, tasty curve like you guys have seen me do before. The only curve ball, to make a really bad pun, is I'm gonna go for a moment over to this look dev timeline that I've already got built out, and I've got a chart prepped, and all I'm gonna do here is use this chart as a reference for grabbing my middle gray, which in this little plugin that I have built for this purpose, I've got middle gray set to 18%. I've told it that I'm in log C, and I've got 3 total steps, and in the middle is my middle gray. So this is pure, perfect 18% gray in log C. So if I go to this empty node that I just made downstream, and I tap that middle gray patch, I've now got a control point for middle gray in my curves. And if I hit Command C to copy this node, and if I go back over to my timeline, my main timeline, and back over to the timeline section of the node graph where I'm going to build this look, and I hit Command V to paste that node, I've now got a template for my creative curve that is going to force mid-gray to anchor where it came in. So it's going to refuse to let mid-gray be moved up or down. And then from here, all I'm going to do I'm actually going to, for reasons that'll become clear in a moment, I'm going to paste 2 copies of this node. We'll deal with this one, number 2, in a moment. Node number 1, I've got that good anchor point, and I'm going to turn all of my channels on simultaneously. And this is where I'm going to draw my overall creative contrast curve. Now, this does actually feel like I am upstream, or downstream rather, of my output transform. So I'm going to wipe these out, and I'm going to do these things. Let's do them in a group, okay? So I've wiped that stuff out at the timeline level. I'm going to add everything into a new group. We'll call it main, because everything's going to live in here. And I'm going to go to my group post clip, which is going to allow me to do what I was just trying to do at the timeline level, but I think it's going to get me some better results. Maybe not. Maybe it was actually fine at the timeline level, and I was just being overly sensitive to where those shifts are in the shadows are taking place. So I'm just going to draw a curve here, kind of by feel, okay? Something like this. And then I'm going to do the same thing up here in the top, like so. So now I've got my very humble beginnings of doing the job of the film print. Okay, I'm just getting some creative contrast into the mix. And that's already not looking half bad, right? And I know that I've preserved middle gray. So even though I don't have my colloid tools and I don't have a solid film print emulation LUT like I might normally, I know that I've got a nice looking curve, and I know that it's preserving middle gray. So that I can live with. I'm going to call this curve. Next, I'm going to do my split toning, which you guys have seen me talk about or heard me talk about a ton. For this, I'm going to ungang my channels, and I'm just going to do a sort of stock cocktail of a little bit of blue into the shadows, a little bit of green to go with that so that we're getting a little tealy down there. And then up in the top, we're going to do a little bit of red. Little's going to go a long way, as it always does. A little bit less of my green. And then I'm going to back everything way off. So I'm going to say, remember these sliders, from 50 to 100 is how much strength is being we're using from these is the overall strength of this adjustment that I'm making on my blue channel. If I go less than 50, I'm actually going to be inverting, for example, this rainbow on the blue channel. Don't want to do that. But I do say want to cut it in half. So I'm going to say like 75 for my blue, because that's half. Same for my green. Same for my red. And let's see how that's feeling. Let's give this a label. And then I will zoom in a little bit, since I know you guys can't see it when I go full screen, and flip that off and on. So that's nothing crazy, and that's desired. I don't necessarily want to do a big crazy look. I just want to get a little bit of kind of film print vibes, and I like the little bit of color separation that I'm getting from tonally separating shadows from highlights and cooling shadows and warming highlights, okay? So I'm kind of on my way here in terms of setting up an overall look. Now, here's the biggest thing that is missing. I've talked with you guys about this a little bit before, but I actually really like doing this look dev exercise solely within Resolve, because I know there's been a lot of questions about it, and it's a really good thing to discuss. You should be able to do what I'm doing right now just within Resolve. If you're using LUTs, or you're using like my products or any other trustworthy like third-party plugin to get your look, it should only be after you've done the homework and gotten comfortable with doing this yourself and realized the walls that you're going to bump into there and seeing the benefit of those other products. Otherwise, you're just turning what could be a transparent and learning process into a black box that you're like, okay, cool. Like footage that looks okay comes in and footage that looks better goes out. Like that's great. But if you're not getting better at your craft by being exposed to a tool and working with it, I think that's a pretty huge compromise. So that's just kind of an aside. But what I was driving at a moment ago is we all at once have like a way more than half of what this look is going to like ultimately, like the impression of it that I'm going to get when I flip it on and off. We have way more than half of that right now. At the same time, we don't have nearly all of it, because all we're doing is manipulating the contrast of our red, green, and blue channels. We're not doing anything interactive. We're not doing anything cubic. We're not actually creating a color palette. We're letting all colors pass through in a technically neutral way. That's great as a baseline for accuracy, but that's not really a great like creative thumbprint to impart on this image. In almost any image I could imagine us wanting to grade, there's some benefit to be had from sculpting down what we could think of as the creative gamut of all incoming imagery into a smaller, more harmonized gamut that's designed for that project. And that's indeed what's going on in a film print. It's a huge part of what we like about a film print because it's pumping all of this contrast and separation and sort of flavor into the image, but then it's simultaneously, it's very much limiting the gamut of colors and confining them to a smaller palette of possible colors that really starts to glue things together and keep things from getting garish. I mean, even like this frame that we've been hanging out on for a while now, like the thing that catches my eye immediately is like these red washing machines. I don't want to see a red that bright and that primary really ever, certainly not in this project. So that's where our RGB mixer is going to come into play, okay? So let's go over to the RGB mixer. And what I'm going to do here, this is again kind of a limitation of our exercise today. My temptation was to take you guys into Fusion and show you in a 3D space what the RGB mixer does, but we're not going to do that today. We're just going to look at what it does on our 2D image, which doesn't give us the full story, but it can give us enough to understand what needs to happen here. So the RGB mixer, for those of us who aren't familiar with it, is simply a name for a tool that we find all throughout image science and all throughout mathematics and linear algebra in general, which is a 3x3 matrix. And what the RGB mixer is saying is for a particular input pixel value, which is going to have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel, what we are saying is to get the output from that input, how much of the input red will go into that output red, how much of the input green will go into that output red, and how much of the input blue will go into that output red. And then we repeat the same 3 questions for our green channel and for our blue channel. And as you would expect, by default, to get a unity position of nothing at all happening, my red output is composed of 100% red, no green, and no blue. And my green output is composed of 100% green, no red, and no blue. And blue, you guessed it, 100% blue, no red, and no green. So right now, my RGB mixer is obviously doing nothing at all. But we can do all kinds of interesting things in terms of bending around the hues of our image by introducing, say, some green into our red channel, or even extracting some red from that same channel. So you can see I'm getting this sort of change in the character of my vector scope here. And I'm actually even getting a little bit of a sort of hue rotation along the way here. So this is something that if you're not previewing it like in a Fusion, like looking at a cube type of thing, you're just going to have to feel your way through to get to a good result. But it's definitely something that I would do, and definitely like as a starting point, if I were to say like, all right, I really want to pull the overall amount of like red in this image quite a ways down. Like, let's see what happens if I go to 80% of my input red and then 20% of my green. That might be, maybe I could do 80% of my input red and then 10 and 10 from my blue and my green. You can see what's happening there on my vector scope. And a good rule of thumb here is if you want to preserve your neutrals in an RGB mixer, then you need the sum of each row to be 1. So 0.8 plus 0.1 plus 0.1 equals 1. Just a geeky thing that isn't like you don't have to think about all the time, but it's a good thing to be aware of. So you can see I'm definitely bringing these reds down on this. And maybe I wouldn't want to go this far. Maybe I just want to go to like 0.85 and then do, I don't know, 0.08 and 0.07 on the mixer. And maybe that's starting to get me a more reasonable sort of overall gamut. And like, this is the fun part about look dev, guys. Like, I feel like I could talk about this for the full hour. I may feel that, oh, I've gone too far with this and I want to back off of this adjustment. Or I might say, hey, with that gamut thing happening downstream, maybe now I want to take my split toning intensity back up to 100 and see how that stuff is feeling, which in this case is not necessarily driving me wild. So I think I indeed will go to about 0.9 in my red, and then we're going to say 0.05 for our green, 0.05 for our blue. 0.9 plus 0.05 plus 0.05 equals 1. So I'm preserving my neutrals, but I'm just bringing down my reds. I'm sculpting my gamut just a little bit on the scopes, but let me go to this view here. But like this to me from here to there makes a difference. It feels like I'm in a bit more of a tucked in kind of world. And again, what I could do here with this or anything else I'm going to do in my RGB matrix is I could go to my key output gain and say, just give me 65% of that gamut limitation and pull things back even more without having to endlessly fuss over that RGB mixer there. So now I'm at 50% of that adjustment. Just a little nudge down here on the scope, just a little change in the image, and maybe that's all that I need. Last thing that I'll say about the RGB mixer that I can use either here at the look level or at the individual clip level, there's another thing that the RGB mixer can do for us. I'm going to do it in a new node here. Let's look at what happens if I have my luminance preservation turned on, which I'm generally going to want to do. And if I go to 0.5 red, 0.5 green, and 0.5 blue, okay? My exposure hasn't changed, has it? What has changed? Saturation. I've got a saturation knob here. So this is another thing that I could actually add to my template node graph if I wanted to, kind of find the top floor for like, what's the most I'm ever going to want to desaturate things? And I could copy this over to my clip level side of things, give this a label, call it like desat, go to my key output gain, zero it out for now. And then let's turn that desat operation off here at the timeline level for a moment, or at the look level. And if I want to play around with this now, I can, if I want to desat my image, I didn't have to burn up one of my choices on a sat knob, and I can just increase the key output gain on my desat node, like so. And same thing would work in reverse. If I add 1.5 red, 1.5 blue, 1.5 green, I will have added 50% saturation to all of my channels. I could save that as a separate node called sat. I could set the key output gain to 0 and then simply increase it to get saturation, again, without ever having to step out of my matrix or break out use up another of my tool choices on that task. So just another bonus of that RGB mixer there. But back to our topic here. Let's look at this look that we were cooking up here. So that's kind of a good start here. And this is something that, again, because I don't, like my normal look dev process would be to look at like, all right, what's happening not only on an image, but on like an RGB cube, and give me, because I have a sense of like what a film gamut will look like on an RGB cube, I can kind of aim at that as well as a particular visual reproduction on one particular image at a time. Since I don't have that, this would be a very exploratory thing that I would be continuing to refine as the process went on. And just playing around with like, you know, how could I sweeten my gamut at the overall look level by playing around with these parameters. And by the way, everything that I just talked about, that's all a fairly color sciencey way of thinking about it. You can also approach all this stuff as like, I'm just going to start twisting some knobs and see if I get some interesting results. Like that's totally valid. And the last thing that I will say about the RGB mixer that I think makes things even more challenging when we don't have like the Fusion 3D Cube view as part of our toolkit, is if I right click and I flip my gamut into linear, just to give a nod to that good guess that was made earlier today, I could do an RGB mixer in linear, which is going to give me quite different results than I got a moment ago. Now, just fair warning, RGB mixer in linear generally doesn't like negative values for your any of these channels, although this preserved luminance thing is going to help. But generally you want to be working on the positive side when you're in a linear domain. But again, like we could talk at length about the sort of mathematical and image science ramifications of what it is to work on an RGB mixer in log or in linear. But you can also just like take my word for it that there's gold in these hills. And if you wanted to do look dev with nothing but offset and curves and an RGB matrix, you could do it just with these tools. And in fact, in my case, like this is going to be my starting point. I would even call this like my gamut maybe. And like at this point, I would feel pretty good about going to the top of my timeline, starting to buzz through images and do what I sort of started doing a few minutes ago of like, all right, let's sweeten that exposure. Let's go for some positive contrast by going to my key output gain and pumping that up a little bit. And if I look at the net of my image here, that's not half bad, right? On to the next one. I'll probably be super lazy because this is all set in one environment, and I'm going to paste the grade from this prior shot and see if it holds. I think it does. Maybe we want to go a little bit warmer here to match that previous shot, like so. On to the next one. This one seems fine. Let's add a little bit of contrast in here. And keep going until I get a better result. And by the time I've added what I feel like is the right amount of contrast, I now feel like I would normally use my pivot. Since I don't have my pivot, I would just go over to my offset, pick things up a little bit. Okay, now I've got a pivot. Let's go over here. Let's steal the grade from the wide, see how close that gets us. Along the way here, I'm going to start to pull references. This wide frame is a great one. And we'll wipe to that. Check this out. I don't know if this one needs this warming operation or maybe just doesn't need quite as much of it. So I'm going to back that off a little bit. On to the next. Paste that grade. And we're off to the races here, guys. And as I start to move into different points in this timeline, I may decide that I want to revisit the behaviors of my creative gamut. Or I might decide here at the local shot level, now that I've built that little saturation gizmo that we talked about a moment ago, or at least I guess I didn't save that off into all of my into my node tree and then ripple that out everywhere, but let's just pretend that I did. I'm going to do 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, set this to 0. And then like in this shot where I feel like even with my gamut control happening here, I would like to attack those washing machines a little bit further. And for that, I would just reach for that key output gain and go a little bit further with it like that. That's not bad, right? So I hope you guys can get a sense for like how I would start to operate on these shots now and just work my way through. You know, like let's look at some of these singles here. Let's maybe open up exposure a little bit. Let's go over to our decon here and decrease some contrast, kind of see into the bottom of things a little bit. Here's kind of an opposite thing. We're like, now I feel like I would want to pivot so that I'm getting a slightly different pivot point for that decon. Since I don't have that, I'm just going to revisit my offset adjustment here. And now I'm getting that same result in essence, just using different tools. So I'll probably grade up a couple more shots as we're talking here today, but I've been talking for a while and I'm sure we've got some questions stacked up. So I'll take a breather here and see what we got there, Gadali.
Okay, Chris is asking to the earlier point, why gain in linear versus offset? I think I know it has to do with offset additive function versus gain multiply function.
Yeah, exactly right. That's just the way that the math shakes out in those two domains. Like if I want to, it's just the way that like doubling of the image works in a log versus a linear domain. In linear, when we multiply stuff, that's the formula for like photometric exposure. That's like the way things work out in the real world. Like if you think about linear light, we're actually in linear light right now. We don't perceive it as linear. Cameras often don't encode it as linear. Displays don't reproduce it as linear. But out here, and the reason we call it linear is because that's what it is. Like a objective measurement device would record a doubling of the amount of light in this room as a doubling in the intensity of the signal. So that's, if you think about what a gain function is, it's a multiplication. So if I wanted to apply a one-stop push in a linear domain, that would be take your input and multiply it by 2 to the power of 1, so that you are getting a one-stop increase. It just doesn't work quite that same way in offset. When we do gain and offset, you guys have all noticed before, I'll break out of my desert island prison for just a moment. When I'm in when we do offset in log, is what I meant to say just a moment ago, we don't get exposure change, we get contrast change. So if I add gain right now, I'm picking up the top, but I'm not affecting the bottom of the image, am I? If this was in a linear domain, I would be moving the entirety of the image like so. What else?
Alexander is asking, could you not almost get every tool by changing color space on the node and using curves.
Yep, absolutely, Alexander. Very good insight. And for the sake of sort of limiting ourselves to a reasonable portion for the hour that we have together here today, I decided not to do it. But like, we could do all kinds of like more complex forms of what I could call gamut sculpture, like I started to do with that RGB mixer. As you said, by moving in between color spaces, color models, tone curves, and then essentially creating, like a sat versus sat, or like basically we could recreate any of our versus curves over here and then some, simply by moving in between different color models and tone curves and using the custom curves. Very good insight.
And we've got a little bit of an answer in the chat, but Sasha was asking, is the RGB mixer kind of the same as printer lights?
No, the RGB mixer is interactive. So it is in the same way that like, think about it this way. This might confuse the issue more for some of you guys, but for at least some of y'all, it will illuminate it. Any of us who know the difference between a 1D and a 3D LUT, that's the difference between printer lights offset and the RGB mixer. So think about in a 1D LUT, I can do whatever I want to with the red channel and whatever I want to with the green channel and whatever I want to with the blue channel, but I cannot make them talk to each other. I can't say, I can, in a 1D LUT, if I like represent it with my custom curves here, I can say, oh, I want my red channel to have this shape to it as it climbs from 0 up to 1. But what I can't say is, oh, at this point, I would like to add a little bit of the blue channel into it. I don't have any means of doing that. This curves tool has no knowledge of anything but the curve that it's currently operating on. I cannot make those things interact at all with and that's the same with the printer lights. So I can add or subtract red, green, or blue, but I cannot add green to my red, for example, or subtract blue from my green. I can't do those things. For that, I need an RGB mixer, and that's exactly what it allows me to do, is that it's technically applying, rather than offset, it is applying gain, but in an interactive fashion so that I can say how much green is in my red and how much blue is in my red and how much green is in my blue, and like all these different combinations. Again, if we just look at it's pretty intuitively laid out, how much red, how much green, and how much blue are going to go into my new red channel. That's something that we can't do with an offset. All we can do is say, how much of the original red, how much of the original green, and how much of the original blue would you like? But you can't like change those contents around except by linearly bringing them up or down.
Okay. And we've got a question from Gabby asking, what is the difference between the highlights slider and the regular log highlights tool? I seem to be preserving more highlight detail when adjusting with the highlights slider.
Oh, that's a good question, and I think a fun thing that we actually haven't talked about in grade school before. So the most important thing, we can answer that in two ways. The easiest way, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's a good one to go on today. Because like a big part of being able to navigate this challenge well is having the ability to meaningfully evaluate tools, right? So if I look at my good old friend, the waveform, let me move my face out of the way so you guys can see this thing. Oh wait, no, it's actually tucked in there perfectly. Great. And let me just for a moment bypass my color management. So I'm looking at this linear ramp, okay? And oh, it looks like I've got just a little hair of my positive contrast node or something turned on here. So the first objective way to evaluate that question is to say like, what happens to the curve when I move my highlights up or down? We're like, okay, that's what happens, at least just in terms of the tonality of the image when I move that highlight knob. And I'm sorry, Gedali, remind me, we were talking about log highlight was the other highlight knob we were comparing to?
Correct.
Okay, cool. Log highlight, if we go over to the log wheels, whose little icons have changed in whatever this most recent version of Resolve is, and really threw me for a loop. And we take a look at these highlights, very similar range, right? Although we can notice that the transition has kind of a harder elbow to it, right? And of course, the other benefit of this highlight wheel, or that what I just identified as not a benefit, I would count that as a con because it's more likely to introduce weirdness into your image. But one of the benefits of the highlight wheel is we can actually set this range and say, no, don't crook that elbow until higher or lower in the chain. So that's what I just showed you guys. That's the best way to evaluate pretty much any contrast or luminance or exposure adjusting tool. Throw up a ramp, kill everything that's giving you other than a pure linear climb from 0 to 1, and look at what the things do and compare them to each other. Stage a shootout, essentially. There's a bit of a curveball here with the highlights. The reason, more than likely, that you are perceiving that you are recovering or preserving more detail with your highlights is there's actually a texture operator going on inside of that highlights knob. So as you bring highlights in, you are adding mid-tone detail as well. So that can be a reason to use or to avoid the highlights knob. I generally, since I know that that's in there, prefer to like do my tone mapping and my highlight recovery or remapping or whatever I'm doing in a clean, more universal operator. And then if I want to try to pump some texture into the upper end of the image, do that in a separate layer so that I can control those pieces independently. That's just a personal preference, but it is very helpful to know, in addition to what range am I affecting with the highlights and how soft is the fall off into it having no influence at all, but also to know that that highlight knob has an effect not only on the tonality of your image, but on the spatial properties, on the texture of the image as well, which, like I said, is probably why you are perceiving a better job at highlight recovery with the highlight wheel. Because if you think about it, if you pump whatever available texture is into that area as you're pulling your highlights in, the idea, the logic behind that behavior is that you will get the perception of additional or recovered detail that was previously clipped. You're not actually doing that, of course, because you're just sharpening what was already there, but it can lead to pleasing results if that ratio of sharpening to reduction works for you in that stock ratio. Let me know if yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Alexander is wondering, how many episodes are you doing of Masters of Color?
There's going to be 8 of those. And then I don't know what the future holds after that. I would love to do more of them. There's definitely more than 8 colorists and filmmakers that I'm keen to spend that time with. So maybe we'll get to do some more. Time will tell. I'll keep you guys posted. And if we're kind of caught up on how are we doing on questions? Do we have more about the Desert Island Challenge here, Godali, or are we getting kind of caught up?
I think that's what we've got for now.
Okay, great. Great. Yeah, so I'm going to keep grading and we'll see what comes up along the way. So, oh yeah, I turned off all of I was like, wait, where did all my pretty look go? I forgot I turned it off here. So, let's just keep flipping through and grading some shots. Now, let's talk about like, what if I could get one more? What would I pick next if I could get a 4th? What I would pick next in this situation, for sure, would be something spatial. Like if we look at a frame like this, where like it's a really strong composition. I really like the headroom and the way that the characters are weighted in this frame. I definitely would want to take some heat off of this portion of the image here in a way that I just don't, I can't I didn't select anything that allows me to make spatial control here. If I had, this would be, like in this very first pass of the project, this would definitely be where I would just take a circular power window, flatten it out to like a horizontal grad, go super, super soft, and then do either an offset, or if I was wanting to do a linear thing, a linear gain, and just kind of like, treat this like a flag and walk it in, try to feel like I'm not whacking my talent too much there. And, that would be my net on this guy if I had that tool available. And you can see, boy, that just does wonderful things. So turns out 3 tools is not enough to get all the magic we normally would want, but I'm going to stick to my rules for now and keep cruising through here. That's really the only thing that I see in this image. And like I was saying, guys, at the beginning of our time together, limitations and necessity can be really, really great catalysts for creativity. I might, in the absence of that, just kind of bias my exposure a bit lower without like letting my talent completely sink into shadows. And that's not a bad compromise. I like would have used the window, of course, if I had it, but that's not a bad compromise to me to just kind of bring that in a little bit. This side, we need to go a little bit warmer, right? Let me get my vector scope back up down here. I've always got one eye on my scopes and one eye on the image itself. And I'm always flipping off and on, say, a balance operation like this to see where I started and where I'm netting out, like so. And a lot of the time, I'll just kind of like spin stuff and see, try things a few different ways and see if I can't get a better alignment. That's starting to feel pretty decent. That's a, just side note, matching wise. It's a tough match because the frame contents are changing radically. There are very few common elements in these frames. The floor is not common. Washing machines are a different color. There's only a little bit of wall here that there was a lot of here. Really the only common sort of hues are my talent's wardrobe and, like whatever I'm seeing of that wall there. So there's just a good side note about like, sometimes it can feel like, oh man, that match isn't great. Like it still bumps my eye. These still trip me up when I'm grading. We want to do the best we can to make them feel contiguous, but like they're never going to feel super flowy because they share very few overlapping frame contents. And the best thing we can do in this situation is actually to go back to the histogram and kind of make sure that our overall like signal intensity is somewhat aligned, which it is. So we got that. These are like VFX shots and little edit cut downs. So I would like grade this shot once the way I did over here. And then I would just shift click all these and then middle click to apply that same matching grade on these. I don't see that being a shot we have to go through many rounds of notes on. I'm going to ripple that same adjustment that I made before. I've got to say, like, I'm really happy with that DSAT tool that we built here. Let's even go ahead and label it. Let's go over here. Same thing. We can just pull in on our exposure. Again, if I would love to have some control and be able to knock this down up here just a little bit, just pinch it in so we're kind of gently nudging the eye more toward our hero. But I can live with this here. Maybe I'll back that off just a little bit. And by the way, like there's we can be reminded as I go through this that like it's not an accident that I'm starting with exposure and then I have balance and I'm often not even moving my balance. Exposure is more important than balance. Our eyes are more sensitive to changes in luminance and contrast than they are to changes in color. I'm not saying color is unimportant. Color matters, of course, but my priority is always going to be on exposure because that's going to be where the biggest difference is going to be made to the end viewer, if I can get that right. And if we look here, like I once again, like this is more just a general grading thing, but once I've got my hero here, I'm going to keep referencing back to that for any frame where it makes sense. And a lot of the time, I'll just look at it and be like, I wonder, what if I steal that? What if I middle click that wide and just see how that does for me? That's not bad. We just need to bring exposure further in, like so. And then so on and so forth. If I look at this side, can probably match that same level of exposure. And I think this film is starting to look pretty decent with the Desert Island Challenge that we've undertaken here. And you guys can see, let's see how many shots there are total in here. Okay, so there's 160. Some of those are like those repeated clock shots that won't necessarily take the same amount of time as a normal shot. But I would feel very comfortable rippling through the rest of this timeline in this course of a next maybe hour and limiting myself to the tools that I have. Yeah, I would probably most often bristle at like, oh man, I need a power window. I need another power window. But other than that, I'd feel pretty comfortable playing around with this thing. And I might hit some instances where I'm like, oh, I really want to desaturate my reds without affecting the rest of the image so much. But like one of the other like lessons that I think we can take away from this Desert Island Challenge as I kind of like wrap us up for the day is it really shows us the power of broad tools and of forcing ourselves to think more broadly and simply for as long as possible. Like I hope every one of you guys have been watching closely for the last hour or so and noticed me land on a shot and had an insight or an observation of like, what does that shot need? And then watched me solve it in a broader way than you would have done if you were not doing a desert island challenge and just doing your normal grading process. A great example of that might be here. If you have that same sort of like hit that I do of like, that red's a little dominating back there. You would probably, your go-to, if you're like most colorists, your go-to would be like a qualifier or, like a lume versus sat or a hue versus sat. If you're more in my school of thought of trying to do things more softly and gently and in a, like that kind of fashion. But I just want you to notice like, this actually did a really good job. Like the only desat that I notice here, like if you were my client, I wouldn't do this, of course, but if you were my client and I told you, oh, I'm going to qualify the reds and desaturate them, you would not like disbelieve me if I flipped this adjustment on and off and told you that's what was happening. So there's this really good lesson hiding in there that like when we are looking for complexity and we are making the base assumption that complexity is what's needed, that assumption proves correct, right? And when we are looking for simplicity and we are making the assumption that simplicity is usually what's needed, that assumption also proves correct. So it really comes to like, what lens do you choose to look at things through? And that's why I choose to look at things through the lens of simplicity, because it's faster and it's never going to break. I don't have a qualifier that I have to babysit here. This is going to travel. This is the ideal way. If I can do it in this way, this is ideal because it's big and broad and soft, and it's doing less to the image than any other approach I could potentially take. So there's some really good lessons here, like I said, with the exercise of limiting yourselves to a desert island challenge like this. It will show you more power and set your creativity free of like, wow, look at all the fun stuff I was able to do and make out of my curves node and my matrix. And I'm using my matrix to sculpt a gamut and to pull or add saturation. And I'm using my offset to manipulate exposure as well as balance. Like you can use all these tools in more ways than you've probably thought of before. So I would encourage you, like on your first pass of your next project, give it a try. Just try a desert island challenge. And even if you know that, okay, I'm going to have to deliver this at some point and the job deserves my best work and it doesn't deserve an artificial constraint, so I'm going to have to remove that constraint at some point, it's still valuable to say, hey, for the next 20 minutes or the next 20 shots or for this pass, I'm going to limit myself to these tools, because even if you're eventually going to take the leash off, along the way, you will probably make some pretty interesting discoveries about what works and what you like and the way you grade that you wouldn't have otherwise made. So that's my sort of case for doing your own desert island grading challenge whenever the opportunity arises. And I can take another question or two before we wrap up for the day, if we have anything out there.
Yeah, got a couple quick ones. First, from Chris, asking, how did you quickly bypass your color management the one time you were doing that?
So I just right-clicked on the clip I was working on, the thumbnail for it, and I said bypass color management. Now, is that showing up? Please tell me my contextual menus show up.
Not seeing that.
Man. Okay, so if my highlighted thumbnail number 24 there, if I right-click on that, let me see, can I potentially get this to appear? I just feel like talk is cheap for these things. Oh, it's not even going to let me do it. You'll just have to take it sight unseen from me. Right-click on a thumbnail, and toward the bottom, about 2/3 of the way down the context menu that will come up, there's an option to bypass color management. And that will flip everything off.
All right. And EC Sonka is asking about some advice on working with versions and also how to deal with them because they reset when you're going between local and remote.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put it this way. I see the utility of versions in a workflow. They are not something that I use. And maybe that's in part due to that observation that you just made that like, oh, they reset in a non-intuitive way when you're flipping between local and remote, which I do many times in any given project. So I use the hell out of remote and local grades. I will, like the other thing that I will do in lieu of what I see some people using versions for is like in this project, for example, in any project, after I've finished this first pass, the very first thing I do before I kick out this QuickTime for viewing, assuming that there's going to be like a review link on Frame.io or something. I'm going to make a stills gallery, and I'm going to call it first pass. And I'm going to right click. I'm going to say grab all stills from first frame and let those populate in. And no matter what, I won't touch this album except to refer back to it and see where I was and what I did. And then going forward, I don't need to up version my clip versions because I have a saved instance in time of where we were at when I kicked out that viewing. So that's obviously not the only reason why you might want to use versions, but that's a common thing people use versions for that I prefer this workflow for, just because it's easier for me to track what I'm doing than when I'm working with versions.
All right, and last quick one. Jamie's asking about thoughts on texture pop OFX. Likes the idea, but has been getting mixed results.
I'm with you, Jamie. I like the idea. It's on my list of like tools to contemplate of like, you know, we can think of the most organic way for me to think of like sharpness or softness in our image, and you know, sharpness in the rough and broad all the way up to the like tight and tiny details of an image is in the form of an MTF, modular transfer function curve. So I've actually had the thought in mind for a while, like, boy, wouldn't it be cool to be able to shape an MTF curve as a tool inside of Resolve. So if I manage to invent that in my diminishing spare time, then I'll let you know, but I'm with you for sure. Like the Baselight texture tool, I feel like even though the form is so similar between them, Baselight gets a little bit better. Texture, you can get optimal results if you make a simple adjustment and do it in a linear domain. You're going to get better results. Just a quick tip there, but I am definitely with you. I've had I use it very, very sparingly right now because I think it's easy to make strange looking images with it, unfortunately. And that'll do it for today, guys. I hope you liked the Desert Island Grading Challenge. I feel like I went on a couple tangents and meandered around this topic a little bit, but I hope we filled this hour with interesting, like thought-provoking stuff, and you've picked up a couple of ideas from our time together. If nothing else, go do your own Desert Island Grading Challenge, and let me know in comments on this video if you learned something from it. I learned a ton from. I kind of was thinking about this all week, to be honest with you guys. It's like, wow, what would those be? And these were not the first three that I thought of, but I think I really could. I could live and die by these tools pretty well. And I learned a ton just from asking the question anew and forcing myself into the limitation here in the grade with you guys today. So I hope you have that same experience the next time you choose to make your own Desert Island Grading Challenge. Thank you guys all for joining me very much. Thanks to Gadali for co-hosting with me. I hope you guys all have an awesome weekend. By the way, we are going to be on our normal Friday schedule for the holiday next week and the week prior. I know we'll all be hopefully on holiday and enjoying ourselves, but I love hanging out with you guys, and I'll be here at home anyway. So I figured we'll put it together, and if you're too busy doing family stuff to make it, then we'll see you in the new year. If you can join, then I think it'll probably be a different sort of grade school vibe than we normally have, and maybe it'll be fun. So I hope to see you guys next week and on New Year's Eve. If not, see you in the new year, when we have so much fun stuff coming that I know I keep teeing up, but I'm not just BSing you. We got an ebook coming out. I've got all new looks coming out that are going to be sort of like set up in a different way than my Colloid Premium products that I think a lot of you guys are going to find really interesting. Bunch of really new stuff, exciting things coming out in 2022. At the top of that list as well is just going to be a lot of new content for the channel here itself. So I'm really excited to share what's coming with you guys in just a couple short weeks, because this year's almost done, man. It's been a wild ride for me. I hope it has been a great year for you guys as well. Everyone have a great day, and I will see y'all all very soon. Take care.